The Hartwell estate sat at the end of Magnolia Drive like a crown jewel resting on green velvet. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, cathedral ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light and scattered it across every room like liquid gold. From the outside, it looked like a place where happiness lived permanently, where problems dissolved at the front gate, where life moved in smooth, unhurried rhythms untouched by ordinary struggle. But Alara Santos had worked inside these walls long enough to know the truth. She had been a housekeeper at the Hartwell estate for 14 months. Long enough to learn that the mansion's owner, 33-year-old Dominic Hartwell, ate his breakfast alone every single morning. Long enough to notice that the family portraits in the east hallway had been turned slightly toward the wall, not removed, never fully removed, as though the person who moved them couldn't quite commit to the erasure. Long enough to understand that a man could own everything the world considered valuable and still walk through his own home like a visitor who wasn't sure he was welcome. Dominic Hartwell was, by every measurable standard, extraordinary. He had built Hartwell Technologies from a two-person startup operating out of a cramped Austin apartment into a global enterprise valued at $4.2 billion. He had been on the cover of Forbes at 29. He had shaken hands with presidents, closed deals in Singapore at midnight and landed in Paris by morning, and once donated $12 million to a children's hospital without issuing a single press release. His assistant, a quietly efficient woman named Carol who had been with him for 6 years, once confided to Alara that Dominic had personally called every family on the recipient list of that hospital donation just to make sure the funds had reached them properly. He was not the man people assumed he was when they heard the word billionaire. But he was also deeply, unmistakably alone. Alara had pieced together fragments of his story the way careful people always do, not through gossip, but through observation. The unused second master bedroom suite that had been professionally decorated and then never slept in. The baby grand piano in the music room that gleamed from her weekly polishing, but never produced a single note. The way Dominic's jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly whenever a family walked past the estate's front gate on Sunday afternoons, parents pushing strollers, children wobbling on bicycles, ordinary beautiful life happening just beyond his iron fence. She had learned, through Carol during a brief and honest conversation one afternoon over spilled coffee, that Dominic had been engaged 3 years ago. Her name had been Vivian. She had been beautiful and ambitious, and everything the world expected a billionaire's partner to be. And she had left him 6 weeks before their wedding, choosing his former college roommate and business partner instead. The betrayal had been layered and devastating in the particular way that only double betrayals can be. The woman he loved and the man he trusted, gone together, leaving a wound that didn't heal cleanly. He had thrown himself into work after that. 14-hour days. International expansions. Acquisitions and innovations and relentless productivity that the business press celebrated enthusiastically without once asking what was driving it. From the outside, it looked like ambition. From inside the mansion, where Alara moved quietly with her mop and her cart and her observant brown eyes, it looked like a man running hard from silence. She had her own relationship with silence, a complicated one. Alara had come to work for the Hartwell estate when her daughter, Marisol, was barely 18 months old. She had arrived in Houston from San Antonio with $42, a duffel bag, and a toddler balanced on one hip, having fled a marriage that had stopped being safe long before it officially ended. Her husband, Marco, had been charming at first and then controlling, and then one evening he had stopped being merely controlling. She had packed quietly while he slept and driven through the night to her cousin's apartment in Houston with Marisol strapped in her car seat, both of them moving towards something uncertain but away from something impossible. The job at the Hartwell estate had been a lifeline. The pay was generous, the hours were structured, and the live-in arrangement meant she could keep Marisol close. During working hours, Marisol stayed in the staff cottage with Rosa, the estate's 70-year-old cook and Alera's unexpected guardian angel, who had taken one look at Alera's careful eyes and quiet strength and decided immediately that this young woman deserved all the support Rosa had to offer. Alera was good at her work, meticulous, respectful of boundaries. She moved through the house efficiently and invisibly in the way that working people learn to do when they understand that their employer's world is not their world, that proximity to wealth is not participation in it, that the correct posture in someone else's grand life is always, always invisible. She had maintained that invisibility faithfully, until Marisol started talking. At 3 years old, Marisol Santos was a small, fierce, entirely ungovernable source of sunshine. She had her mother's dark curls and enormous brown eyes and her late abuela's gift for saying exactly what she thought at exactly the wrong moment. She called Rosa my Rosa with a possessiveness that made the old woman laugh until she cried. She had named the estate's stone garden fountain Gerald and regularly brought Gerald small offerings of dandelions. She believed wholeheartedly that butterflies were sky flowers and that clouds were God's cotton candy, and she shared these beliefs with anyone within earshot at full conversational volume. She had not yet been formally introduced to Mr. Hartwell. This was intentional. Alera was careful. She kept Marisol in the cottage or the garden's far corner during working hours. The staff quarters had a separate entrance. There was no reason, no practical reason, for a billionaire who valued his quiet and his privacy to encounter a 3-year-old who narrated everything she noticed in real time and once told a grocery store stranger that their shoes were the wrong color for their feelings. But the estate's grounds were beautiful and sprawling, and one Thursday afternoon in early June, Alera turned her back for 37 seconds to collect a dropped bottle of cleaning solution from the utility cart, and 37 seconds is, as every parent of a 3-year-old will confirm, precisely enough time for the entire world to rearrange itself. When she turned back around, Marisol was gone. The garden gate, which Alera had believed was latched, was not latched. And somewhere in the 12,000 square feet of marble and memory and carefully maintained silence, a small pair of sneakers with light-up soles was already moving towards something none of them were prepared for. Alera pressed her hand flat against her chest, feeling her heart knock hard against her palm, and went after her daughter. She could not have known, in that moment of ordinary panic, that those 37 seconds were about to change everything, for Marisol, for herself, and for the solitary man who ate his breakfast alone every morning in a house that had forgotten what it felt like to be a home. Dominic was in the study. It was the room he retreated to when the silence in the rest of the house became too loud, which was, he recognized with the wry self-awareness that comes from years of expensive therapy he mostly refused to apply, a deeply contradictory way to describe a problem. But it was accurate. The silence in the Hartwell estate wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that had shape and weight, the kind that pressed against your ribs and reminded you, with steady persistence, of everything that used to fill it. The study was different. In here, there was the reliable company of work. Screens and spreadsheets and acquisition briefs, and the quarterly projections for the Southeast Asian market expansion that currently required his attention. In here, the silence was purposeful, productive. It had an agenda, and he was grateful for that. He was reading a contract amendment when he heard it. A small sound, rhythmic, like something tapping. He looked up from his screen. The study door, which he always left partially open out of a habit he'd never examined, was being pushed slowly inward. Not quickly, the way an adult would push it. Slowly, with effort, the kind of tentative determination that suggested the person pushing it was working against a size disadvantage. He watched the door move for a full 3 seconds, genuinely uncertain what he was about to see. And then Marisol Santos walked into his study. She was wearing denim overalls over a yellow shirt with a small embroidered sunflower on the pocket. Her sneakers lit up pink with every step. He noticed them immediately, their cheerful impossibility against his study's dark hardwood floors. She had dark curls that bounced slightly as she moved and enormous eyes that swept the room with the efficient, unself-conscious curiosity of someone conducting a formal inspection. She was carrying a dandelion in one fist. She looked like a painting of something the world needed more of. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked directly at him. He had faced down boardrooms of hostile investors. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals while sleep-deprived and jet-lagged. He had managed crises that made national news without once losing his composure publicly. In his entire professional and personal life, he could count on one hand the number of times he had been rendered completely speechless. A 3-year-old in light-up sneakers had just used one of those rare occasions. She tilted her head at him, studying him the way he sometimes studied balance sheets, carefully without hurry, reserving judgment until the data was complete. "You're sad," she said. Her voice was clear and matter-of-fact, the way children state things they understand to be simply true, without the adult instinct to soften observation into question. She wasn't asking. She was telling him what she saw. Dominic opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "You have a sad face," she clarified helpfully, as though he might need the additional information to orient himself to the conversation. "Like my mama sometimes. But my mama's sad is quiet. Yours is loud." He stared at her. "I'm sorry." She didn't appear to find anything surprising about his confusion. She walked toward his desk with the absolute confidence of someone who had been invited, set her dandelion carefully on the edge of his keyboard, and then looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes and said, "Gerald likes flowers. Does your desk like flowers?" "Gerald," he repeated. "The fountain." She said this as though it were commonly known information. "I bring him flowers, so he's not lonely. Fountains have water, but they don't have flowers, so they might feel like something's missing." She paused, appearing to consider the philosophical implications. "Do you feel like something's missing?" The question hit him somewhere below the sternum with a precision that no boardroom opponent had ever managed. He was still working out how to respond to a 3-year-old who had apparently walked into his private study and performed an emotional audit on him within the first 90 seconds of their acquaintance, when the door flung fully open and Alara Santos appeared in it. He had seen his housekeeper many times over the past 14 months. She was efficient and thorough and quiet in the way that people who have learned to take up minimum space become quiet. He knew her name, and he knew her work was excellent, and he had, to his private shame, not looked at her very carefully beyond those facts. People in positions of significant power develop this habit, this efficient, incurious categorization of the people in their orbit, without always recognizing it as the failure of imagination it actually is. He looked at her now. She was breathing hard. She had clearly been running. Her dark hair was coming loose from its bun, and there was a streak of cleaning solution on her left forearm, and she looked, at this particular moment, absolutely terrified, the specific terror of a working mother who has momentarily lost track of her child in a wealthy employer's home and is now calculating, in real time, the potential consequences of that lapse. He recognized fear. He had seen it in its many forms across many contexts. But this particular variety, the fear of someone who could not afford for anything to go wrong, who had built something careful and fragile and was watching it teeter, landed in him differently than it usually did. "Mr. Hartwell." Her voice was controlled, but barely. "I am so deeply sorry." She must have come through the side garden. "I only turned away for a moment, and, Mama." Marisol turned with a delighted smile that suggested she found this reunion charming rather than urgent. "I found the sad man. I gave him a flower." Alara closed her eyes for one brief, pained moment. Marisol. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, took her daughter's hand with the gentle firmness of a parent retrieving a small force of nature from a delicate situation, and looked at Dominic with an expression that was equal parts apology and braced anticipation. I am so sorry. This will not happen again. I promise you. She said I have allowed sad, Dominic said. Alara blinked. I'm sorry, your daughter. He looked down at Marisol, who was now studying his bookshelf with the same methodical interest she'd applied to him. She said I have allowed sad. I've been trying to figure out what that means for the last 3 minutes, and I think she might be right. Silence settled between them, but it was a different kind of silence than Dominic was used to. It had warmth in it. A question. The very faint beginning of something he hadn't felt in a long time and almost didn't recognize. Possibility. Alara didn't know what to say to that. She had prepared for anger, for cold dismissal, for the kind of efficient displeasure that powerful people deploy when their space has been invaded. She had not prepared for a 33-year-old billionaire to stand in the middle of his study with a dandelion on his keyboard, looking at her daughter with an expression that was 1 part baffled and 3 parts something that looked, against all reasonable expectation, like wonder. She does that, Alara said finally, her voice softer than she intended. She sees things. Dominic looked from Marisol back to Alara, and for the first time in 14 months, he actually looked, not at his housekeeper, at the person. I can see that, he said quietly. Marisol, having completed her bookshelf assessment, turned back to face him with the air of someone who had reached a conclusion. I'm Marisol, she announced. I'm 3. How old are you? 33, he said. She nodded slowly, processing this. That's a lot of 3, she said. And Dominic Hartwell, who had not genuinely laughed in longer than he could accurately remember, laughed. It came out rusty and surprised, like a sound that had been stored in a drawer and forgotten. But it was real. Completely, startlingly real. And Alara watched it happen, her daughter's small hand warm in hers, and felt something shift in the room, something quiet and significant, the way the air changes just before a season decides to turn. June arrived the way it always does in Houston, sudden and humid and generous with its heat, as though the sun had been waiting all spring for permission to fully commit. The magnolias along the front drive bloomed in great white clouds. The garden fountain, Gerald, Dominic had started thinking of it privately, with a slight smile he wasn't entirely willing to examine, ran with what seemed like renewed enthusiasm. The estate, which had spent 14 months holding its breath, began, almost imperceptibly, to exhale. Something had changed after the afternoon in the study. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone would have marked on a calendar. But the quality of things had shifted in the small, specific ways that matter most, the ways you only notice if you're paying the right kind of attention. Dominic began leaving the study door fully open. It was a small thing, likely meaningless. He told himself it was about air circulation, about the June heat, about nothing in particular. But the truth, which he approached with the careful sideways attention he gave to things he wasn't quite ready to look at directly, was that he'd found himself listening for the sound of small light-up sneakers on hardwood floors. He heard them 3 days after the study incident. He was on a call with his Singapore team when the sneakers appeared in his doorway. Marisol stood there with a fistful of wildflowers she had apparently collected from the garden's far border, a small, colorful chaos of things that had no business being picked, and she held them toward him with the grave ceremony of a diplomat presenting credentials. He held up one finger to her. She waited, with surprising patience actually for someone who was 3. When he ended the call, she walked in, placed the flowers on the corner of his desk, inspected his screen briefly, and said, "That's a lot of numbers." "It is," he agreed. "Do the numbers make you happy?" He considered this honestly. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes they just make me tired. She nodded as though this tracked with her general understanding of numbers. Rosa's banana bread makes me happy, she offered. Maybe you need some. He smiled. Maybe I do. She was gone before he could say anything else, sneakers flashing as she disappeared back down the hallway, leaving him staring at a collection of wildflowers next to his laptop and feeling, for reasons he couldn't have fully articulated to his therapist or his board of directors, significantly better than he had before she arrived. This became a pattern. Not every day. Alara was careful. He could see her being careful, could see the deliberate management of her daughter's enthusiasm, the quiet course corrections when Marisol's orbit began drifting too close to the main house. He respected the carefulness. He understood what it cost people to be that careful. He had watched his own mother be that careful for years, calibrating herself constantly against the expectations of people who held power over her comfort, and he had grown up understanding in his bones what that kind of vigilance looked like. But he had also begun, gently, to create openings. He mentioned to Carol that Marisol was welcome in the garden adjacent to the study during his afternoon calls. He asked Rosa, a little too casually, he suspected, whether Marisol had any favorite books, and then ordered 12 of them and left them in the staff cottage's common room without comment, attributed to no one. He told the groundskeeper to leave the patch of wildflowers along the east garden border untrimmed. He told himself none of this was significant. He was not a convincing liar, even to himself. What was harder to manage, harder to cajole away, was what had started happening with Alara. She had spent 14 months as a careful invisibility, a competent, professional, appropriately distant presence who maintained his home beautifully and asked nothing of him and expected the same in return. This arrangement had suited them both fine, her because she needed the job and the stability and had learned, long before she arrived at this estate, that making yourself small was the safest way to survive proximity to power. Him because people who want nothing from you are the easiest kind to be around when you've been badly hurt. But the study incident had cracked something in that careful arrangement. He had seen her afraid. Not the managed, professional variety of discomfort, but the real, raw fear of someone protecting something precious. And he had seen her afterward, when the fear passed, had seen the intelligence in her eyes and the dry, quiet humor she deployed when Marisol said something particularly on the nose, and the way she looked at her daughter with a love so complete and unguarded that it made the watching feel like a privilege. He started finding reasons to speak with her directly. Small things, framed professionally. A question about whether a certain cleaning product was appropriate for the new kitchen countertops. A mention that the east guest room's window had been sticking. Ordinary employer-employee conversation that gave him, he was aware, an unreasonable amount of something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction. She was interesting. This was the thing he hadn't anticipated and couldn't stop noticing. She had a quiet, precise intelligence that surfaced unexpectedly in a single well-chosen word, in an observation delivered so dryly it took him a beat to realize it was funny, in the way she asked him, once, whether he'd eaten anything that morning with the directness of someone who had decided that professional invisibility could, in very specific circumstances, accommodate a small amount of genuine human concern. He had not, in fact, eaten anything that morning. She had looked at him with an expression that managed to be both entirely respectful of professional hierarchy and completely unimpressed by his nutritional choices, and said simply, "Rosa made frittata." And that had been that. He'd eaten the frittata. It was excellent. He'd thanked Rosa for it, which made the old woman look at him with a knowing brightness he chose not to investigate too closely. By the second week of June, two things had become undeniably, inescapably true. The first was that Dominic Hartwell was falling, Slowly, and with the careful disorientation of someone discovering they've wandered far from a path they thought they were on, into a feeling he hadn't experienced in 3 years and had largely stopped expecting to experience again. The second was that Father's Day was 12 days away, and Marisol, apparently, had plans. He didn't know this yet, but Rosa did, and Carol did, and Alara, who had discovered her daughter's plans during a Tuesday evening bath time conversation that had left her sitting on the bathroom floor with her heart caught somewhere between terrified and something she refused to name, definitely knew. She just hadn't figured out what to do about it. It began, as most profound and inconvenient things do, with a question that had a very simple answer and several very complicated implications. "Mama," Marisol said, 12 days before Father's Day, while Alara was towel-drying her curls after the Tuesday bath, "who is Father's Day for?" Alara kept her hands moving. She had an excellent poker face, developed over years of practice. "It's a day to celebrate dads," she said. "People who are fathers." Marisol considered this with the depth of concentration she usually reserved for important negotiations about bedtime. "Do you have to be a real dad," she said carefully, "or can you be almost dad?" "What's an almost dad?" "Somebody who acts like a dad, but isn't one yet."
She paused.
"Like how a seed is an almost flower." Alara's hands stilled in her daughter's hair. "Baby," she started. "Mr. Dominic is an almost dad," Marisol said simply. "He has the sad from not having a family. I can see it. It's right here." She pressed 2 fingers to the center of her own chest with a precision that suggested she was pointing at something she could genuinely see. "And I think if somebody did something nice for him on Father's Day, he might feel like almost family is still a family." Alara sat down on the bathroom floor. This was a thing she sometimes did when her daughter said something that required her to take a moment and remember how to operate her own body. She sat on the tiles, which were slightly cold, and looked at her 3-year-old, who was looking back at her with those enormous patient eyes, and she felt the full, complicated weight of the moment settle over her. Because Marisol was not wrong. She was, with the terrifying accuracy of children who haven't yet learned to look away from truth, correct. Dominic Hartwell did carry that specific sadness. Alara had seen it every morning for 14 months, in the empty chair across his breakfast table, in the slight pause before he answered when someone on the phone mentioned their kids, in a piano that sat unplayed, and the nursery-decorated room, with its door kept politely closed. And her own child, 3 years old and powered entirely by love and dandelions, had seen it too and decided, with the clean logic of the unjaded, that it was fixable. "What did you want to do?" Alara asked carefully. Marisol's face lit with the particular brightness of a plan whose time has come. "I made him a card," she said. "At Rosa's table. Rosa helped me with the letters." Alara's heart did something complicated. "When did you make a card?" "Wednesday. When you were doing the upstairs windows." She added, with gentle preemptive reassurance, "Rosa says it's very good." She cried a little. Rosa cried. Happy crying. She explained the difference. Marisol patted her mother's knee. "Mama, don't worry, face.
Mr. Dominic is nice.
He laughs at my jokes even when they're not that funny." She paused, reconsidering. "My jokes are pretty funny, but he laughs extra, and that means he's good inside." Alara thought about the laugh in the study, the surprised, rusty sound of it, the way it had changed the room. She thought about the books that had appeared in the cottage common room, attributed to nobody, which she knew perfectly well had come from the main house because she recognized the Hartwell Technologies corporate account packaging, and because Rosa had informed her with absolute casualness and unconcealed satisfaction that the boss asked what Mari liked to read. She thought about the wildflowers, deliberately untrimmed. She thought about the frittata. She thought about the way, over the past 3 weeks, Dominic Hartwell had stopped being a carefully maintained professional distance and had started being a person, warm and wry and quietly attentive, with laugh lines that deepened when Marisol said something particularly on the nose, and a way of listening that made you feel, when you had his attention, like you were the only thing in the room worth attending to. She was not going to think about that last part. She had established this firmly. "What does the card say?" she asked. Marisol ran to retrieve it from under her pillow, children's most trusted archive, and brought it back with both hands, offering it to her mother with the solemn care of something precious. It was a folded piece of heavy craft paper, the kind Rosa kept for her recipe clipping project. On the front, in Marisol's improving but still enthusiastically irregular handwriting, assisted by Rosa's careful guidance, it read, "Happy Father's Day, Mr. Dominic." Alara's throat tightened. She opened it. Inside, in the same careful mixed printing, "You are not my dad, but you have a dad heart. I can tell because you make the sad go quiet. Thank you for my books and for laughing. Love, Marisol. P.S. Gerald says Happy Father's Day too." Alara sat with the card in her hands for a long moment. It was 3 years old's handwriting and 3 years old's syntax and 3 years old's complete, unsophisticated understanding of love, which is to say it was the most accurate description of Dominic Hartwell's particular goodness that Alara had encountered, and she had been paying attention. She felt something move in her chest. Something she had been very carefully, very deliberately not feeling for several weeks, in the way you avoid looking directly at a bright light, not because it isn't there, but because looking directly changes things you can't easily change back. She was his employee. She was a single mother with $42 to her name 14 months ago, who had arrived at this estate as an act of survival and had built something careful here: stability, safety, a life that was small but hers. She could not afford the confusion of feelings that had been quietly assembling themselves in the corner of her awareness like uninvited guests who kept demonstrating, through excellent behavior, that they deserved to stay. And she was practical about this. She was always practical, a billionaire. A man whose world was structured around the assumption that he would have the most power in any room he entered. The landscape of that kind of power was not safe for people like her, no matter how sincerely it was wielded. She knew this. She had learned it. "Can I give it to him on Father's Day?" Marisol asked. She was looking at her mother with a particular combination of hope and patience that was Marisol Santos's most devastating emotional configuration. Alara looked at her daughter, at the card, at the small perfect fact of this child, who had more emotional courage in her 3-year-old hands than most adults developed in a lifetime. She thought about Dominic laughing, about books in the cottage common room, about wildflowers untrimmed.
"Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that.
"We can give it to him on Father's Day." Marisol threw both arms around her mother's neck with an enthusiasm that nearly knocked them both over on the bathroom tiles, and Alara held her daughter tightly and tried not to think about Sunday and what it might mean and what it might change, and mostly failed. Father's Day arrived with unusual gentleness, a softer sun than Houston typically offered in June, a slight breeze moving through the magnolias, the kind of morning that felt deliberate, as though the weather had been informed of what was going to happen and had adjusted accordingly out of respect for the occasion. Dominic was awake before 6. He had slept poorly, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the specific texture of his sleeplessness. It wasn't a restless, driven insomnia of someone reviewing acquisition strategy. It was the lighter, less comfortable wakefulness of someone who was feeling something and hadn't finished deciding what to do with it. He made his own coffee, which he rarely did. The kitchen was quiet and warm and smelled of whatever Rosa had been baking since 5 a.m. She was always the first one awake in the estate, arriving in the kitchen with the quiet authority of someone who understood that feeding people is a form of love that requires early hours and no audience. He sat at the kitchen island with his mug and watched the garden through the window and thought, without trying to direct or manage the thinking, about the past 3 weeks. He had not had 3 weeks like these in a long time. He had been happy. Not the productive, forward-moving satisfaction of professional achievement, which was the closest he'd come to happiness in 3 years and which he had taught himself to accept as a reasonable substitute. This was different, warmer, less structured, ungoverned by outcomes. It had the quality of something found rather than built. It had the quality of Marisol Santos announcing, at the breakfast table 2 Tuesdays ago, she had been eating a banana at Rosa's insistence while Alara finished the upstairs rooms, and Dominic had stopped in the kitchen for a second coffee, and the morning had reorganized itself into something none of them had planned. That Gerald the Fountain was feeling very good lately because someone had been remembering his flowers. Then she had looked at Dominic and said, "Are you feeling very good lately too?" with the directness of someone conducting a wellness check, and he had sat down at the kitchen island and said, "Yes, actually, he thought he was," and Marisol had nodded with satisfaction and resumed her banana. It had the quality of Alara. That same morning, leaning against the counter with her coffee mug and laughing at something Marisol said, laughing fully, without the usual careful calibration, just laughing, and the sound of it had done something to the kitchen that the kitchen had clearly needed for a long time. He was still in the early, disorienting stage of acknowledging a feeling rather than managing it, the stage where you haven't yet decided what to do with it, where it exists primarily as a warmth in the chest and a heightened attention to small, specific things. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The way she said his name, carefully, always with the mister that he had stopped correcting because the correction required a conversation he wasn't ready to have yet. The way she looked at Marisol, every single time, with that absolute, unguarded love. He had not been loved like that. He had been wanted, admired, desired. He had been chosen and then unchosen. But looked at like that, like just existing was a source of continuous, renewable joy, that was something different. Something he had seen up close for the first time in his own home and had spent 3 weeks trying not to want for himself. He was not succeeding. Rosa came in at 7, found him at the island, and looked at him with that knowing brightness she'd been wearing for 3 weeks, and said nothing, which was the most knowing thing she could have done. "Happy Father's Day, Rosa," he said dryly. "I am not a father," she said, equally dry, beginning to arrange things on the counter with her usual efficiency. "You should go sit in the garden. It's a beautiful morning. It would be a shame to spend it in here being confused." "I'm not confused." Rosa looked at him. "I'm slightly confused," he admitted. "Garden," she said. "Go." He went. The garden at 7:15 on a June morning was, he had to admit, worth being outside for. The light was still gentle, slantwise and golden, and the fountain, Gerald, he thought and almost laughed, was doing its steady, cheerful thing in the center of the main garden path. He sat on the stone bench nearest it, mug in hand, and let the morning sit with him without trying to make it useful. He heard the cottage door at 7:40. Small sneakers on the garden path. A pattern he had learned to recognize with a precision that probably said something about where his attention had been going. He turned. Marisol was walking toward him with the focused intentionality of someone on a mission. She was wearing her yellow sunflower shirt and her light-up sneakers, and her curls were slightly wild from sleep, and she was carrying something in both hands, held with the ceremonial care of something extremely important. Behind her, a careful distance back, still being careful, still managing the distance, Alara followed. She was wearing a pale blue dress he hadn't seen before, and her hair was down, and she looked, in the morning light, like something that had always been part of this garden, and he'd only just noticed. He stood up. Marisol stopped in front of him. She looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes and took a slow breath the way people do before they say something they've practiced. "Happy Father's Day, Mr. Dominic," she said. And she held out the card. He took it. His hands, which closed billion-dollar deals without trembling, were not entirely steady. He looked at the cover. "Happy Father's Day, Mr. Dominic," in careful, irregular, beloved letters, and something moved through him that started at his sternum and traveled outward, reaching every part of him that had been closed and cold and carefully managed. He opened it. He read it. "You are not my dad, but you have a dad heart. I can tell because you make the sad go quiet. Thank you for my books, and for laughing. Love, Marisol. P.S. Gerald says Happy Father's Day, too." The garden was very quiet. The fountain ran steadily. A bird moved somewhere in the magnolias. The morning held perfectly still, as mornings do when something important is happening inside them. Dominic Hartwell, billionaire, 33 years old, a man who had built empires and survived devastations and spent 3 years running from silence, stood in his garden on Father's Day morning with a handmade card from a 3-year-old and felt every careful wall he built come down. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just quietly, inevitably, like something that had been held up too long finally, deciding to rest. He pressed the card gently against his chest. Closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were bright. Marisol was watching him. "You're doing the happy crying," she said, with recognition and satisfaction. "Like Rosa." "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough. "Yeah, I think I am." She stepped forward and wrapped both arms around his leg in a hug of complete, uncomplicated certainty, the way children hug when they have decided someone belongs in their circle and the decision is final. He looked up at Alara. She was standing with her hand pressed flat over her mouth, her eyes full, watching her daughter embrace this man in the June morning light. This man who had left books in the cottage and laughed like something coming back to life and looked at her child like she was the most extraordinary person he'd ever encountered, and she was not managing her expression at all. For the first time in 14 months of careful management and professional distance, she was not managing anything. Dominic held her gaze. He reached out one hand, palm up, not reaching for her, not pulling, just offering. The way you offer something to someone who has reason to be careful about what they accept. An open hand. A choice. For one long, still moment, she didn't move. Then she crossed the garden, and she took his hand. They stayed in the garden for a long time that morning. Marisol brought Gerald a particularly large contribution of dandelions and declared it a celebration, and then sat in the grass nearby and had a prolonged and apparently very satisfying conversation with a butterfly, and the fountain ran, and the magnolias breathed out their white sweetness into the warm June air. Dominic and Alara sat on the stone bench, not quite close enough to be unambiguous, but closer than professional distance, and they talked. Really talked, the way people talk when the careful scaffolding they've been maintaining finally comes down. Not in a flood, but in the honest, easeful way of two people who have been paying close attention to each other for weeks and have accumulated a great deal to say. She told him about Marco. Not everything. That would take time, and she was not yet ready for all of it, and he didn't ask for more than she offered. But she told him enough that he could understand what safety meant to her and why she held it so carefully, and what the cost of trusting had been. She told him about San Antonio and the $42 and the night drive and Marisol asleep in her car seat, and she told it without asking for his reaction, just telling it because it was true and he had offered an open hand. He told her about Vivian, about the double betrayal and the wedding that didn't happen, and the peculiar way a wound like that teaches you to expect abandonment from the people closest to you, how it recalibrates your baseline assumptions about what you deserve. He told her he'd spent 3 years being very busy, so he wouldn't have time to notice he was lonely. He told her that a 3-year-old in light-up sneakers had pointed that out to him in roughly 90 seconds and that the experience had been simultaneously mortifying and, probably, the most useful thing that had happened to him in years. Alara laughed at that, a full and unmanaged sound, and he looked at her the way he'd been trying not to look at her for 3 weeks, and she let him look. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. "Being open. I've gotten very good at being productive instead." "I know," she said. "I've been watching." "I know you have," he said. And then, with the careful honesty of someone doing something that costs them something, "I've been watching too." Marisol, having concluded her butterfly meeting, appeared in front of them suddenly and looked between them with the assessing calm of a very small relationship counselor. "Are you going to be happy now?" she asked. Alara opened her mouth. "We're working on it," Dominic said. Marisol nodded. Apparently, this was satisfactory. She climbed up onto the bench between them with the unself-conscious certainty of someone who belongs exactly where they've decided to be, settled herself comfortably, and looked out at the garden. "Gerald is happy," she announced. "I can tell." They sat there, the 3 of them on the stone bench in the June morning, and something settled over the estate that it had not had before. Not peace exactly, because peace implies the absence of complication, and their lives were complicated in ways that would require patience and time and care. But something close to peace. Something that had warmth in it and weight and the specific quality of being real. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9, assessed the scene in the garden with one comprehensive glance, went back inside, and allowed herself a quiet moment of immense satisfaction before beginning to prepare what would be, she had already decided, the finest Father's Day breakfast the estate had ever seen. In the months that followed, things changed slowly, and with intention, the only pace that builds anything worth keeping. Dominic and Alara navigated the particular complexity of their situation with the care it deserved. They acknowledged the power difference and talked about it honestly more than once, in the ongoing way of 2 people committed to not letting things fester. He offered and she decided, and he respected her decisions even when they required patience, and she trusted him slowly, and then more, not because the risk disappeared, but because he kept showing up in the ways that made trust reasonable. Marisol remained entirely confident that she had handled everything correctly. She told Rosa in early July that Mr. Dominic is starting to be a real dad instead of almost dad, and Rosa agreed with an equanimity that suggested this was news to absolutely no one. The books multiplied in the cottage common room. The piano in the music room began to be played again. Dominic had known how, years ago, and found his way back to it haltingly and then with increasing ease, and Marisol sat beside him on the bench and banged the lower keys with enthusiastic imprecision, and he never once told her to stop. Gerald the fountain received flowers regularly. The house that had spent years holding its breath began, room by room, to remember what it was built for. On a Tuesday evening in October, Marisol was sitting in the study doing what she called helping with the numbers, which meant sitting in the large chair across from Dominic's desk, drawing in her new sketchbook while he worked, narrating her artistic process in a steady, comfortable stream, when she looked up and said, without particular preamble, "If you married my mama, would you be my actual dad?" The study went very quiet. Dominic set down his pen. He looked at this child, this small, extraordinary, specific person who had walked into his silence and told him it was loud and handed him a dandelion and a card written with the whole heart of 3 years old and fundamentally, irrevocably changed his life, and felt the full weight of the question and everything it carried. I'd want to be, he said carefully, if it was what both of us wanted. And what your mama wanted. Marisol considered this. You should probably ask her, she said, with the pragmatic authority of someone who has thought this through. I'm working up to it, he admitted. She nodded. This was apparently acceptable. She returned to her drawing. He looked back at his screen, said nothing for a moment. Then, Marisol. Yeah, thank you. For the Father's Day card. She glanced up, smiled at him, her mother's smile, warm and direct and absolutely sure of itself. I knew you had a dad heart, she said simply. I could see it. He had learned, by now, not to argue with her on the things she could see. Outside the study window, the October garden held its last warmth, the fountain running steadily in the evening light, and the house that had been so carefully, persistently quiet for so long was filled, genuinely, continuously, irreversibly filled, with the sound of living. The only sound, it turned out, that had ever been worth building anything for. And,